Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Week That Really Was with John McGurk and Sarah Ryan for this week, ending the 31st of May, 2024. Sarah, it's nearly June. It's nearly summer at long last. How are you, first of all?
I'm good. I'm very happy that it's nearly June for more than the weather.
Hmm. Um, yes, that's right. You've got 1 week to go in the job from hell, don't you? I I should say, by the way, in case anyone thinks there's any kind of inside joke here, the job from hell, I mean by that any campaign with a week to go is hellish. It's no comment on the particular candidate or campaign that Sarah is involved in, but it must be insane, with 6 days to go until voting day.
It is, but I always feel like, do you not think that like with a week to go, it's kind of less insane than it is in 2 weeks to go in a weird way? It's kind of, I don't know. It's still insane, but insane in a different way.
Okay. Yeah, so this is
But
less organization. If you haven't got your posters up by now, you're never going to have them up.
yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
And most of the days are kind of booked now and things are in, it's kind of not insane, but definitely different.
Indeed. All right. Well, we're not going to talk about the election this week because I think next week, when you'll be listening to this, our episode next week will go out on the day that everyone's voting. So Sarah and I might do a full in-depth discussion of who's going to win, who's going to lose, and all that sort of stuff. We might talk about some elements of the election later on in the show. We'll talk about Sinn Féin's campaign launch, where we'll talk about the Children's Hospital. We'll talk about Michael D. Higgins. We'll talk about the surrogacy bill. But Sarah, I want to start with actually a story that Gript broke this week and not that many other people picked up on, which is this meeting in Cork that Ben Scallon was at. Or not that he was at, but that a good source of his was at, where a lot of insane things were said. And I want to ask you, because the chairwoman of the Children's Rights Alliance, which is a state-funded NGO, basically said that all of us white people are walking around with a massive bag of privilege that we have to get off our backs. So what are you going to be doing over the next couple of weeks to get rid of your privilege?
I mean, nothing, John, nothing, because I don't have any, because this is all garbage made up in the minds of, ironically, this is a symptom of privilege. If this is all you have, if this imaginary situation is all you have to create in your brain and you have the time to do it, well, then you have immense privilege.
We'll get the exact quote, actually, in fairness. So this was Tanya Ward, the chief executive of the Children's Rights Alliance, who said, "White people are walking around with a backpack of invisible privileges in our society, and we don't realize that, and we should all be working collectively to get rid of that backpack so we're all treated equally." She also complained that the far right is being platformed in Ireland, and that is leading to discrimination. So that's quite a big statement, isn't it? That, we all carry invisible privileges. I mean, my take on it would be that, yes, I have certain privileges. For example, I had two parents. A lot of people in Irish society grew up in a single parent household. So that's a relative privilege that I had. I went to a good school. Some people don't go to such good schools, but none of those are intrinsic to my skin color. So that strikes me as a bizarre claim. I mean, do you think it's not just a little teeny bit racist?
I think it's racist, but I also think that it's kind of it's a manipulation trick, because ultimately I think fundamentally I believe that if you are racist, you are racist. You're somewhat aware of your own thoughts and your own beliefs about things inside your head. Even if you pretend that you're not, you know that you're racist. And I think that this, invisible privilege trope is rolled out for people who, so even the people who know they're not racist can be told that they're racist, if you follow what I'm trying to say. So I think it's just another manipulation trick. The other issue I have with this, and I tweeted about it today, is that this is the head of the Children's Rights Alliance of Ireland, another NGO. And as I tweeted earlier on, I, a 40-year-old mother of three living in Ireland, am not represented by the National Women's Council of Ireland because I don't agree with them. And, I'm not a man dressed up as a woman, it seems. But also now my children aren't represented by the Children's Rights Alliance of Ireland because they're white and, obviously privileged. And it just makes me begin to wonder, all of this bloated bunch of NGOs that we have. And I know that people will always say, oh, but what about the Simon community and what about this one? Not all NGOs, but that's not I'm not talking about all NGOs. I'm talking about a huge proportion of our NGOs are ideologically led think tanks bloated with funding from a government that don't represent the people they pretend to represent, are completely farcical. The referendum proved that the National Women's Council of Ireland, as we've said already, is a joke. But, this statement from the head of the Children's Rights Alliance is another demonstration that here's another NGO overpaid, overfunded, and complete garbage, not representing what they're supposed to represent. There's no way you can represent children's rights in Ireland if you think that the white children that you represent are more privileged than the others. Because I can tell you, there's loads of white children in Ireland who aren't privileged at all. And if you said, if you had a TD who was running for election, who wanted to represent you, and he thought that you were privileged, would you think that he'd have your best interest at heart going into the Dáil? No. So does the National Children's Rights Alliance head have the best interest of white children if she thinks they're all privileged? No.
No, and it's funny. And by the way, the article in question, I think I'm if you're listening to this on YouTube, I think I'm gonna put a link to it into the description below, because there's so much in it that we couldn't possibly talk about everything that was said. But
yeah,
in terms of what you were saying about, one of the things that was said by a woman called Janet Walker, who was lecturing the meeting, which, by the way, is taxpayer funded. It was a meeting of NGOs. Some Sinn Fein TDs were there. The Lord Mayor of Cork was there. It was all supposed to be behind closed doors, but we happened to get somebody into it. Is that it's not enough to be simply not racist. You have to be anti-racist. So if you're somebody out there who you describe people, the vast majority of them not being racist, which is of course true, but that's no longer enough. You have to be actively anti-racist, which means, I think, it doesn't have a definition, but I think it means you have to be proactively almost reverse racist and conscious of all this stuff about white people apparently having it better. And there's also
but what does that even mean? Does that mean that if you're at a dinner party and someone starts saying horrible racist stuff, that you say something? But sure, most people do that anyway. Or are you only really being actively anti-racist if you work for an overpaid NGO where you get paid a salary to do so?
Mm-hmm. Well, the other thing is that, just on that, about what is anti-racism, they also made clear at the meeting that it's really important to ensure that there's more government funding for NGOs tackling racism by talking about racism all the time. So in other words, there's this behind closed doors meeting. They're literally saying to each other, we have to hype up the problem of racism because then there's more government funding to help tackle it. So in other words, that could be interpreted as, we have to exaggerate the problem to make sure that the government keeps funding us to talk about it. So, I mean, I'm looking at this from the outside, and my opinion is a lot of this is just scamology. We have this theory in Western society about elite overproduction, which is we've so many college graduates that we have to find them jobs, and we're finding loads and loads of people jobs in things like anti-racism campaigning, and their existence must be justified. I am that cynical about it. I think that's what a lot of this is about.
Well, I think, but also a lot of it is just, I mean, there was people will see in the article, at this event, there was a poet who, read lots of poetry about racism, the problem of racism in Ireland, and how George Enchenko was killed by the police because killing a black man is an achievement in Ireland. But I'm sorry, here's the hill I'll die on. That's bullshit.
It is. It's offensive bullshit, by the way.
No, it's just bullshit. It's just bullshit. I'm 40 years of age. I've grown up in Ireland. Saying that doesn't make it true. Killing a black man is an achievement in Ireland. It's unbelievably offensive to Ireland, and it's also just not true. Not true. A poet can stand up. You can stand up on the stage at this nonsense event, and you can, where they had a British teacher who came over, and a white British teacher, and talked about racism and how, she's still racist, and she has to admit that she's racist because even though she doesn't know she's racist, she's still racist, and she's a racist. And then a poet, with Tupac playing, and killing a black man is an achievement, is considered an achievement in Ireland. It's just all bullshit.
Yeah, but the point I was going to make is that it's amazing what you can say about the Gardaí if you're on a particular side. I mean, if somebody from the dreaded, in inverted commas, far right said, that the Gardaí really enjoy beating up anti-migrant centre protesters in Newtown and Kennedy because they feel good about beating up the disadvantaged, there'd be outrage. But somebody can stand up at a taxpayer-funded event and say that it's an achievement for the Gardaí to kill. By the way, an event that the Gardaí attended. That's the other
Yeah.
point. The Gardaí were actually there. They were represented at it, and they had to listen to this. So yeah, I mean, as I say, the article is in the description below. You can read all about what this event was and what happened at it and what was said at it. Ben has been desperately trying to get comment from the people who attended. Most of them have been keeping their mouths shut and refusing to comment. The state has been making very clear that it doesn't fund all of the organizations there and shouldn't be held to account. And of course, no other media outlet has been remotely interested in it because, let's be honest, a lot of this stuff is mainstream now behind closed doors. It's not something we talk about in polite society.
But it's also, I mean,
It is actually what we talk about in polite society. We don't talk about it in front of the plebs.
yeah. But it's also, I mean, there's the element of the NGO and the fact that this is state funded. That's one issue. But there's also just the simple issue that, people are encouraged and applauded by an audience to stand up and say stupid things like that aren't true.
Mm-hmm.
And no one calls them out. I mean,
anyway, in brighter news, we can buy babies now. The surrogacy regulation bill, which includes the regulation of commercial surrogacy, passed through the Oireachtas today, actually. I think it was Thursday, the 30th of May. So I think it's worth marking that moment because it's one of those ones. I was saying to somebody today, it reminds me a little bit of the Gender Recognition Act in the way that it has been kind of snuck through the Oireachtas on the down low without that much public debate. And I have a funny feeling that in 4 or 5 years, there'll be a whole lot of people going, wait, when did that come in? But
like the Gender Recognition Act.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just on this, it makes it legal essentially to go overseas and pay a woman to have a baby for you and then take the baby home. And I just think that is one of the most horrendous things that has ever been legalized in any Western country ever. Because
but it's kind of tricky. Here's the thing, because we've had the conversation about surrogacy before, and I've said that I feel like it's a difficult one to talk about because I don't actually have any friends that have used a surrogate, but I've had a lot of friends who've had very, very difficult fertility journeys, we'll call them, and desperately wanted a baby, and in more than one friend of mine has had the woman has had problems with carrying or progressing a pregnancy, we'll say. And has one in particular, I remember, was kind of getting towards being in a place where she thought she might look at surrogacy, and then thank God she ended up having 2 children. So it is a tricky subject because I believe in, as people who will listen to this podcast know, like I believe in the family, and I believe in people having as many children as they want, and I'm a big fan of that that life plan. So it's hard because I feel a lot of compassion for people who desperately want a baby, and this is the way they see to get a baby, to have a baby. And the other thing is that because I'm a believer in science, like the way a man can't be a woman, etc., if I use my eggs to create an embryo with my husband and that baby is carried by someone else, that baby is biologically mine. And I do have compassion for the legal loophole or the legal gap that's been there up until now, where the Irish state doesn't recognise me as the mother in that situation, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I just have a fundamental disagreement with you. This rarely happens on the show, but I have a fundamental disagreement with you. I think the mother of a child is the person who gives birth to it. I have never given birth. I never will give birth. You have on at least 3 occasions. So you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but like the human body produces hormones that are designed to bond a child to its mother when it's born.
Yeah.
I guarantee you that if you were a surrogate for somebody and you carried that child for 9 months, once it was born, you wouldn't think, oh, well, that's not mine. I mean, it's just come out of your body.
Oh no, but I'm not diminishing that part of it at all. And like I've said on the podcast before, I remember, funnily enough, and I thought it might be the beginning of a sea change in the attitude about this, because sometimes this is the culture we live in, is that, you know, the Kardashians do start certain conversations off. And Khloe Kardashian, who had one child that she carried herself and then a second child by a surrogate, said publicly that she felt less bonded and different about the second child, who was birthed by another woman. And I agree with that. I'm not diminishing at all the bond and the connection that's created by the fact that I carry my children. And I'm not a fan of commercial, or I wouldn't be in favor of commercial surrogacy whatsoever. I just do have some compassion for people who feel like it's their only option to have a child. Now, like with everything, now all you see is, I don't know, it's the commercialization of it is icky. I get it. I agree with you. But I just feel like if you look at somebody like Rosanna Davison, and she used a surrogate in the Ukraine, and then she's legally not the mother, and this legal issue where she's not on the baby's birth certificate or whatever. What would you suggest is the answer for that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make it about personalities or individuals, because people, so I'm not going to talk about Rosanna Davidson particularly. But and what I've said, I think when we had this conversation in the past, is that I have absolutely no issue whatsoever, ethically, morally, legally, with what you might call voluntary surrogacy. So, if for example you were to put your hand up and say, John, your wife and you can't have a kid, I'll carry a kid for you because I'm your friend. That would be an incredible act of nobility, and no issue with it. It's when you commercialize it that I have a problem. Because
I agree with that. Yeah.
But more fundamentally than that, I also think it's kind of, there's a human tragedy, but there's also something I think deeply wrong with the world, where people are going to that length to create children when there are so many children without parents. Like, I think, were I in that position where I desperately wanted a child and couldn't see any other way to do it, I think adoption is the moral thing to do. I think it's the honorable thing to do. Of course, in some cases, that's also very expensive, tragically, but it shouldn't be. I think we live in a world where there are so many children desperately in need of parents and a loving home. If you can provide that, I think that is the option that state policy should be encouraging. And yeah, I don't have sympathy for people who pay women to carry their children, because I think what you're doing there is you're buying somebody else's body. I think to go to take that decision to rent out your womb for 9 months, you've got to basically either be in a very deprived society, very poor, or in desperate need of cash. So I think there's an exploitative issue with it. And I think it's one of those things that, in the law, you're a lawyer, there's this concept of informed consent, which is that you have to be fully cognizant of all the consequences of the decisions you're taking when you enter into a contract. So if it turns out that there was, if a contract is exploitative, or if somebody doesn't have the full information beforehand, it's null and void. I don't see how anybody entering into a surrogacy arrangement could be fully cognizant of the decision they're making, because they cannot know how they will feel when that child comes out of them and they have to hand it over, never to see it again, and literally have no legal right ever to be called its mother. And I think when you're regulating commercial surrogacy, what you're essentially doing is you are completely severing in law, the relationship between a child and the mother who carried it. That surrogate mother, has no rights basically ever to see the child again. I think that's a horrendous abuse of the law. I think if you give birth to a child, you are its mother. Maybe not genetically, but by, in terms of the way the world works. And I think for courts and the law to be creating this structure where kids can be legally separated and severed for all time from the woman who gave birth to them because she's been given a check. I think that is the most immoral, exploitative, awful kind of contract that you could possibly regulate for. So I'm fundamentally opposed to it. I don't know if I
Mm.
explained it well, but that's what I think.
Yeah, I know. I just this the problem is that in Ireland the toothpaste is already out of the tube for a number of families. That's where I feel like it gets a bit tricky. You know, like I'm fundamentally opposed to commercial surrogacy as well, but I feel that it's created a tricky situation already. And I'm not sure what you do with that. Um, yeah, I don't know.
Well,
Ultimately, I
we
think
had this,
I'm
yeah.
not disagreeing with anything that you're saying. I think it's taking advantage of somebody's poverty. I think that, I mean, I've heard of, I've been pregnant many times, and I'm not a person who, I know there are people out there who love being pregnant. I don't. I find it very hard on the body and difficult. And there's no way that I would do it unless I was poverty stricken. And I think that that's the situation for a lot of women. Um, you know, and the fact that couples can kind of fly over and collect this baby and fly home is what's the Handmaid's Tale-esque. You
Yeah.
see a lot of feminists going on about the Handmaid's Tale, and how, when I remember during when Trump was, um, talking about we're close to being in the Handmaid's Tale. I can't remember what the land, the world that was, or the
Mm.
place that was called, but that we're close to being in the Handmaid's Tale. This is the Handmaid's Tale. This is literally the Handmaid's Tale. Women being used for their bodies to give children to wealthier people. That's the Handmaid's Tale. That's the entire concept, really. So, yeah, I'm not in agreement with it in principle, but I think that what could have been done here with the law to remedy the problem that is already there is a conundrum.
Yeah, I mean the other elements of this, I would say, is that we had a scandal in Ireland a long time ago, or not a long time ago, still ongoing, about adoption and adoption
Mm.
of kids to the United States and their relationship with their biological parents, people never seeing each other again, and a lot of those kids were traumatized by it. And I think one of the things that bothers me about this as well is that you're making decisions for children that might affect them and traumatize them for their whole life.
Yeah.
You're saying you will never know the woman who gave birth to you. And I think there's something very queasy about it. The point that you make, which is a good one, is about the fact that in many cases, because this hasn't been regulated and it's been tolerated for so long, you have these families that exist, like the one you mentioned earlier on, where the mother is not legally or lawfully the mother. But I mean, I would have thought that could have been regularized through adoption. I would have thought you could simply have it, it's legal to adopt children in Ireland. I would have thought that if you are the mother of or indeed father of a surrogately delivered child, that there
Mm.
was a way to regularize that through adopting the child, which would preserve, of course, the link with the biological mother if the child ever wanted, not the biological, but the birthing mother, if the child ever wanted to determine that. But it seems that option wasn't explored, because I think that the purpose of this legislation isn't to regularize those situations, but to create more of them, to
Mm.
facilitate it and create more of them. Yeah, so I don't know. And look, there may be people listening to this who are in that situation. There may be people listening to this going through an infertility journey who are desperate and looking around for options. And if the views expressed by me have upset you, then I'm sorry for that. That wasn't the intention of expressing those views. But I also think one of the problems we have in society is people not saying things they think because they're afraid of
Yeah.
upsetting people. So I think it's fair that you know where we stand on that.
And I
Um,
think it's also we're very soon after, as you pointed out, some of our history as a country to, pretend that, like, I know people who are adopted. I know people who found out that they were adopted later, who found out, who looked for their families, etc., etc. And I think that it's to use the word at the beginning of of the podcast, I think it's an immense privilege to not know what it feels like to not know where you came from, to not, every time you go to a medical appointment and you're asked about medical history, to not know what it is, to never meet the person who gave birth to you, to not know the circumstances of where you came from. And I think that there is a lot of people, like, who are we to say that a child won't want to know more about where they came from later? And you know, a lot of people, the piper will need to be paid on some of this later. But unfortunately, it's part of a wider picture of, you know, people want what they want in modern society and they want it now. And, you know, if you're a man who wants to be a woman, you get it, and everybody has to accept it and call you what you want and do what you want. And if you want a baby and you want a baby now and you're a couple, you just pay somebody to have it. I mean, I've seen videos online of one in particular recently of this single trans man, gay man who's dressed up as a woman, but I don't think he's trans. And, you know, he's got a wig and these big long false nails, and he's just been given this baby girl and he's parading it around and using the baby to sell his online shampoo and conditioner and, you know, boost his business with this baby that's, you know, 2 or a week old, maybe tiny, tiny baby. And obviously there's something in that that's deeply.
There is a reason. I mean, I am a conservative in the sense that I believe the world is ordered in a particular way for a particular reason, and the way the things of excuse me, the way the things that happened are developed in the natural world, they've developed for a reason. And I think when you start breaking the link between giving birth to a child and being the parent of that child, you're playing with fire. There are, you know, and what we're doing increasingly in the West is commercializing life. Like you're turning a literal human baby into a commodity to be traded for a fee. And you're not placing any restrictions on who can purchase that baby in many respects. Maybe in some cases you are, but in most respects you're not. There is no doubt that this is the kind of thing that will be, maybe not in Ireland, but certainly across the Western world, exploited in the worst possible way by the very worst actors in society for their own gains. That is inevitable. That there will be cases of this nature. Not amongst heterosexuals and homosexuals and everyone in between, by the way. I'm not trying to insinuate anything about anybody, but that's just the reality. But I also just the whole thing makes me deeply uncomfortable, because I don't think, and I say something that's controversial, I don't think there's a right to have children. I think some people, unfortunately, will discover either that they can't find a partner, maybe they do find a partner and they can't have children. And that is a cross in some ways you've got to bear, I think. You can't, and if you really want a child, there are so many children out there who desperately need a family. I think this business of going through a kind of commercial transaction to create a human life for what is ultimately your own gratification, it is ultimately for your own gratification, for your own sense of self-worth. I think that's a bridge too far. I really do.
I mean, I think I agree with that, but I think it's worse than that for me as a woman and as a mother, that it's part of a wider picture, which is that it's dismantling women. I mean, you just see that it feels, and I've said it before on the podcast, that I never considered myself to be a feminist by any stretch of the imagination, but I have had 3 children, and you know, there's just this wider picture of, you know, men and women's sports, men and women's spaces, men and women's prisons, a referendum to remove the word mother from the Constitution, a severing of the you know, need for mothers, the role of mother in society being kind of diminished all the time. And it feels like a concerted effort to diminish women and mothers. That's, you know.
And it goes far beyond that, of course. I mean, it just strikes me that almost everything about modern society is, and I'm not a woman, so in some senses this is an incidental observation, doesn't affect me, but everything in modern society is kind of an assault on women. And we've discussed all aspects, from the sexual revolution to the explosion in pornography to the to the basically, like, you have to be a career woman. The company's offering women the choice to freeze their eggs until they're 40, and to put off having children until the most fertile years of their life have gone. The fact that we're now commercializing women's bodies as carriers of children, as well as commercializing their bodies in the sex trade. And all of this stuff is being presented as progressive, when, and the worst thing, of course, you can be in modern society is patriarchal. That's the irony, where in some senses we're living in the most patriarchal society in human history. Um, it just strikes me as bizarre, and a realization a lot of people may yet come to that they haven't arrived at yet.
Yeah, because be kind, John. And this is the thing. Be kind. And everybody, deserves to, as you say, like, everybody deserves to get exactly what they want whenever they want. And, that's the end of it. And whatever makes them happy. If you do anything that stands in the way of them being happy, you're just not being kind. And when people eventually wake up, they'll see that while they were busy being really kind to one person, they were actually being extremely unkind to others.
Well, I think we'll leave it there on that, but it's a good note because you're talking about kindness, and there has been some kindness this week, Sarah. The government is being very, very kind to the people building the National Children's Hospital.
The old hospital, John.
What did you say?
The old children's hospital.
Yes.
We get a good run at it every few months.
We do. It's
what
now.
What will we talk about when it's built?
The irony is, I suspect we'll have lots to talk about when it's built as well. But for now, it's not going to open its doors now until August of 2025 at the earliest. That is the new latest date for completion. But Sarah, I have a sneaking feeling we're going to get to August of 2025 and we're still not going to have a National Children's Hospital.
There is not a fibre of my being that believes that hospital will be open August 2025. That's just over a year away.
The funny thing is,
like, I also saw that one of the unions came out and said they're concerned that they won't have enough staff, there won't be enough doctors and nurses to staff it. I'm also concerned that the ice will melt on the ice rink that I'm building in my back garden. But since neither of those things are of an immediate concern, who cares?
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing about this is, I was reading a headline in RTE today, which described the Children's Hospital as the most expensive building in Ireland, which of course it is. But it's also the most expensive health building in the history of humankind. I think that point has to be made over and over again. Ireland is leading the world. We are building literally the most expensive hospital ever built by man, ever, since we first left the swamp. Nobody has poured more resources into a public health building ever, or a single public health entity, than the Irish state is pouring into this children's hospital. In fact, you can go and look on Wikipedia, which has a helpful list of the most expensive buildings ever built, and you'll find the Irish Children's Hospital down there. It's about 37th, I think, in the list. And if you look at all the things that are below it, some of them will blow your mind. So,
John, even at that, it's. When that used to be said a few months ago or a year ago or whatever, however many, we were told that it was going to be, yes, but it was going to be a state-of-the-art hospital. It was going to be the best hospital in the world. It was going to be this and it was going to be that and it was going to be the other. And like, I'm past the point of caring if it's the most expensive thing in the world. Just get it built. Mm-hmm. Why is it still not built? And then I just have to laugh at Micheál Martin coming out today and blaming whatever they're called, one of the building companies, saying that they're trying to extract more money out of the situation. And I tweeted about that earlier on, saying hopefully someday Fianna Fáil will have a Minister for Health who'll be able to get this sorted. I mean, do they take us for fools?
It's absolutely
what's going on. If you had a guy doing a job in your garden that had a time limit and a budget, and the budget was now quadrupled, the time limit was kicked out again, and he was starting to blame one of his suppliers, you'd laugh at him. Who is in charge of this? Who is in charge of this?
Well, that's a good question. Who is actually in charge of it? Is it the Minister for Health, or is it the Office of Public Works? Is it the Department of Finance? I mean, there's one of the things about this government is that there's actually nobody who will take responsibility for it and say, yeah, that's my job to build the children's hospital. It's the most expensive project Ireland has ever entered into in the history of our independence as a state. And I ask anybody listening to this podcast to ask themselves, who is in charge of it? Who is the person responsible for delivering this on time and on budget? And the fact that you can't answer that question is a big reason why it's not on time and not on budget. Because nobody in politics wants this hanging around their neck. So therefore, it's kind of been left up to a committee of civil servants.
Yeah. And every couple of weeks or every couple of months, should I say, there'll be an announcement made about how it needs either more money or more time, one or t'other. And then a number of people in high political office in Ireland will kind of, pass the parcel really fast as if it's a giant bag of shite that's on fire. And then the story will kind of dwindle after a few days and it'll all go quiet again until next month or the month after when it'll come up again. I'd say they're absolutely fuming that it's come up about 10 days out from local and European elections because that's not convenient at all because, we were busy distracting everybody with putting the Palestinian flag up above Leinster House and hoping that everyone will forget about all of the massive problems that this government has created for the country. So I'd say they're fuming that this has come up and it'll come up again and again and again. And I'm now willing to bet my hard-earned money that there's absolutely no way that hospital will be ready in August 2025. No way.
No, I mean, and it just seems to me that aside from that, like, where is the accountability in the contract? Because you mentioned the example of somebody coming to build something in your back garden and them going massively over budget and massively delayed. Like, if you enter into a contract with a builder to build your house and he breaks the contract, you can sue him. Like, how has this been permitted to happen? It's one of those ones where I think people's eyes glaze over. And it's something I talk about all the time is the big number problem in politics. People will get outraged. And we had that example this week of the Fine Gael council candidate who had to pull out, because she basically nabbed, what was the amount of money that she got in order to withdraw that objection?
I think it was two installments of 15,000 and then 100,000 worth of work on her house.
Yeah, so that's a big sum of money by anyone's imagination, but everyone can relate to it. And that's why she had to pull out, because everyone is like, that's a phenomenal amount of money you've just extorted, in essence, for withdrawing a planning objection. Well,
yeah, go on.
I'm not going to, extortion is a crime and the cops don't seem to think it meets that level, but that's what I'm saying in essence. I mean, technically.
She came out and withdrew from the election and said it should never have happened. So nothing to see. Move on.
Yeah, whereas that would barely pay for an hour's work on the children's hospital, that sum of money. But people's eyes glaze over. Once you start getting into the billions, people's eyes, it's one of the most persistent problems with living in a democracy, and particularly in Irish democracy, is that the bigger the mess up, the less we care. Like, we're intensely focused, and our anger is intensely focused on stuff like some lad, claiming $2,000 he shouldn't have claimed on his phone bill. Or somebody getting 10K here or there, because those are numbers that every human being can relate to. You can imagine what you could buy for 2,000 euros or 10,000 euros or 20,000 euros. But, given that the biggest ever Euro million win in this country was, I think, 140 million or something like that. Once you start getting into 2.8 billion, which is literally 20 times that amount, people can't relate to it, so that their eyes just kind of glaze over, and they don't think about the enormous amount of money that's being wasted on this. Yeah. That's my theory, anyway.
But it shouldn't be one, or it shouldn't have to be. They're completely different things. I mean, again, it comes back to there's a you're right that people's eyes glaze over because the sums of money are so big, but and I think often deliberate use of language that divorces the concept of that it's our money being paid on this, and the government acts like they kind of pull it out of their own wallet, if you know what I mean. But I think that it's all a culture of, waste, and people get annoyed with smaller amounts of money, and that's all fine. But, it's a completely separate thing. The Children's Hospital is the most expensive, as you say, the most expensive building built in the world. No accountability. There's no face of it. There's nobody to blame. There's nobody to resign. Like, what's to say this isn't still going on? We're not in another delay next year. And then the government has to go into a general election, and there'll be talks for a year, there'll be talks maybe for a year now. There'll be talks for a couple of months or whatever. And then the programme for government will be done. And then it'll start. And then there'll be a new Minister for Health. And on we go.
Yeah, I'm just working out exactly how much money it is per household. So yeah, the Children's Hospital has cost every household in the country, yours, mine, there are about 1.8 million households in Ireland, €1,300. That's how much it is. So if smaller numbers make sense to you, that's how much we spent so far. Every single household on the Children's Hospital. It's a
And and and,
phenomenal amount of money.
and my point is, if if it was state of the art, best hospital, best practice, best this, best that, knew everything, amazing, amazing, amazing children's hospital, and it was built, and all of the kids, maybe not necessarily my kids, maybe they'll be too old or whatever, but the kids could go there, and it was, children who needed operations and children who needed this, that, and the other. Were getting the services that they needed from the state. I'd say fine, 1,000 whatever per household in Ireland. I can live with that. I can accept that. But there's no end in sight here.
Yeah, everyone I think would pay. I mean, I would pay
Yeah.
if that was somebody told me that's where my taxes are going, that's what we're going to do, that's what we're going to build, this is how much it's going to cost. Fine. But the thing is, we all know it's not going to be finished on time. We all know, because we live in this country, that there are going to be teething problems. It's going to be substandard, that all the equipment isn't going to be there. And we all know it's going to end up costing a whole lot more than that as well. But what drives me batty is kind of like the shrugging of the shoulders, the kind of national, oh, well, what better can we expect? I mean, it's baffling. If a private company was doing this, everybody involved would be sacked. Everybody involved would be sacked. If a private company's project went so far over budget and so far delayed in time, every single person would be sacked. Whereas the people responsible for this, whether it's in the civil service or in politics, are not going to pay a single bit of accountability for it in their careers. In fact, they'll probably go on to manage other projects. Like, this business of failing upwards in Irish society drives me batty. I think it should drive loads of people batty, because like, this wouldn't happen in the private sector, but in the public sector, you just are just allowed to fail upwards, make a mess, go on to the next thing. Anyway, speaking of which, what did you think of President Higgins?
Yeah. What about him?
Well, he's a good example of failing upwards, I think. But he said this week, because I mean, I think he shares some of our views, because he said it should be really, really easy, Sarah, to solve the problem of children's spinal health surgery. I think not rocket science was the phrase he used to fix it. Which just strikes me as, I mean,
Well, it's weird because I find that kind of irritating. You know what I mean? Like, first of all, more kind of sticking his oar in from somebody who shouldn't be sticking his oar in, for starters. But also, it's kind of like one of those situations where, like, I've been minding the kids all day and they're having one of their completely feral days, and I've been giving out yards to them all day or whatever. And then, Keith comes home from work and he starts giving out to them. And I'm like, oh, whoa, 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 whoa. They might be assholes, but they're my little assholes. Don't you dare talk to them about them like that. This kind of thing. So it's a bit like, this guy rocks him, but I'm like the biggest critic of the government. But I'm like, if it's all such not rocket science, buddy, why didn't you stay in Leinster House then? Instead of sitting up in the gaff with your dogs.
yeah, look, to be honest with you, I know we're supposed to have respect for our first citizen. I know we're supposed to speak of him as if we are British subjects speaking of our king.
No,
he is
I
our.
don't. No.
Oh, no, but that's how the media treat him, isn't it? His every utterance is to be respected. He's sort of above politics. He's above criticism. This guy is a dose. He is a plague on the country. I mean, this wasn't his first mess up this week. First of all, and according to the chief rabbi of Ireland, he invited the new chief rabbi in with various other members of the Jewish community, and then he started lecturing them about Israel, which is, in any other country, the definition of anti-Semitism. If you're holding Irish citizens responsible for the actions of Israel because they happen to practice the Jewish faith, that's anti-Semitism. You don't do that about anybody else. If there was a British citizen in Ireland, you wouldn't bring them in and lecture them about Brexit. So if you're bringing in a Jew to lecture them about Israel, big problems there. Of course, he gets away with it. He gets away with it. The media reports it.
Diddly eye, and he has a teapot in the shape of his head, and it's all so cute.
Yeah. Then the examiner goes and does an interview with him and describes him as wise.
Oh.
And then he comes out and says, "Oh, sure, fixing children's spinal surgery, something that, in fairness, I'll say this much for Simon Harris. I don't agree with him. I don't rate him. I don't particularly think he's the most competent leader we've ever had. But I'll tell you one thing. I firmly believe that if fixing children's spinal health surgery, and I talk about scoliosis here, was something that Simon Harris could do in the morning, I believe he would do it. Not only
Of
because
course he would.
he's politically incentivized to do it, because it'll win him loads of votes, but also because I think he is fundamentally a human being like you and me and would like to help children in severe pain.
Yeah.
So if it was as easy as simply waving a magic wand, it would be done. So for Higgins to sit there in his ivory tower and have a go at everyone else and say, oh, it's not rocket science. I mean, you're a poet.
Yeah.
And you can't even write good poetry. Don't tell me, talk to me about rocket science. Somebody said to me today, we should have a conversation on this podcast about whether it might be an idea to reduce the presidential term to 1 7-year term, because this presidency feels like it has been going on for my entire adult lifetime. Like, when is it going to be over?
I know. When is it over?
I think November of 2025 but it'll actually get worse, because then he'll be the ear president or ear uchtron or whatever they'll call him. And he'll be going around the country, and his every utterance to every university lecture hall will be faithfully reported. While the new president is ignored.
But I mean, I think that the thing that's grating about that is also makes it worse is the phraseology. If he said, I'm deeply disturbed, or I'm really disappointed at the pace in which, these scoliosis operations for children are happening or whatever. But it's like, you and I would be highly critical of lots of things. We're extremely critical of the Children's Hospital, and, we'd be highly critical about lots of things about the government all the time on this podcast. But he's a man who was a politician himself. He was a TD, a member of the Oireachtas, and for him to just kind of shrug it off like this isn't rocket science, it's just so patronizing and like dismissive of the way that Ireland works. And again, I wouldn't be, like yourself, a fan of Simon Harris, but just to kind of, everyone wakes up, has a cup of tea, and then decides, I think I'll just stick my oar into this thing this week. And it's like, oh, shut up, you pleb. Cut a couple of ribbons and go to bed.
He wasn't done there. Because then he came out on Tuesday and he said, we cannot continue with a market-driven system of agriculture. So he wants to go down the old Stalinist road of collective farms, by the sounds of it. And he says we can't be focusing on volume. And he wants to get the market out of agriculture. I mean,
what's that got to do with the presidency?
Run for election then to an office where you can make policy choices, and go and stand in a mart in Tipperary and tell them all that you want to end the market system of agriculture. I mean, you weren't elected to be the philosopher king. And, I just say, I hope, I am going to, in the next presidential election, whether I agree with the candidate or not, whether I think the candidate is an outright Nazi or not, I'm going to vote for the most right-wing lunatic I can find on that ballot paper. And then I'm going to go to the next most right-wing lunatic and the next most right-wing lunatic after that, in the hope that we get a president who is the opposite of him. Not because that will be any more appropriate, but because maybe then some of these idiots cheering this little buffoon will realize just the damage that he's doing to the presidency. I want them to have to suffer through somebody who mortifies them on the international stage. So, and that would be my protest vote against him, because it's embarrassing. But it's also corrosive to democracy, because he is laying the groundwork for exactly what I've just described. He's laying the groundwork for all kinds of bad actors on both flanks of politics to take that office and just use it as a bully pulpit, without any accountability or responsibility for what they say.
Yeah, because it was never used like that before, and they all just let him away with it.
Yeah, and they all act. This is the worst thing. They all act like he's doing something revolutionary. No, he just has no self-discipline.
Yeah,
he has, and the reason you know that is because his first couple of years in office he had the self-discipline, but then he got bored. So he just doesn't have the self-discipline to act in the best interest of the office. There's a reason why the last Queen and the present King of England, who I'm sure have many political views, don't air them. And that is because if they did, the monarchy wouldn't last for more than another generation, because people simply will not tolerate somebody who's not elected, and isn't accountable to them mouthing off all day. And obviously the presidency is elected, so there's that slight difference, but he's not accountable in any way, shape or form. He can say all these nonsensical things and never have to, do anything about them. So yeah, I am just so sick of him. I'm so sick of him.
But he was also elected. I mean, I didn't vote for him, but he was also elected to kind of like, pet the dogs and like kind of like say your little poems and all that kind of nonsense, and not to stick his oar into everything that when he gets bored of an afternoon. And he just continues to do that all the time about international things, about domestic things. And it's all, a lot of people, and like certain journalists I won't name come to mind, they love him and they think it's all wonderful and he's wonderful or whatever. But they'll feel very differently about that overreach becoming the norm when it's a different president.
Yep.
They'll never admit it, but they will.
Oh, what do you mean they'll never admit it? They will flip on a sixpence. Like if like I don't know.
They'll never admit that it was his fault.
Oh, they'll never admit that it was his fault. Yeah. But they will go back if a president of the opposite political flank were to get in and start saying things like, for example, Ireland's done enough on climate change now. We're really hurting people here. We need to wait on other countries to do their bit first. There'll be a national outrage about the president intervening in politics and calls on the government to shut him up and rein him in.
Yeah.
Like, you know that. I mean, the hypocrisy won't bother them. I mean, the hypocrisy is the point, as somebody I know says. It's to rub your nose in it to some extent. Anyway, back to people who are accountable. Sinn Fein said this week, I saw you reacting quite strongly online to Sinn Fein basically saying that the people saying, Sinn Fein are traitors and we're not going to vote for you are a small minority. And in fact, Mary Lou is being welcomed like the returning Caesar on the doors.
Yeah, sure, Jan. No, I don't think that's true. I mean, obviously Mary Lou has to do Mary Lou, and Mary Lou's hardly going to stand there and say hi to the media. My councillors are getting hockeyed out of it everywhere they go, and we're trying to desperately just hold on to what we have and avoid a complete meltdown of our councillors. She's not going to say that, and that's fine. I don't blame her for that. But I'm on the canvas, and I find that unbelievably difficult. I'm willing to go out on a limb and say that it's simply not true. I met somebody the other day, funnily enough, who's canvassing for Fianna Fáil, and he is a friend of mine, and he was saying to me, he said that the vitriol towards Sinn Féin on the doors reminds him of the vitriol towards Fianna Fáil in 2011, and I would agree with him. That's what it reminds me of. Pure rage, and I think that Sinn Féin are in free fall. Vote-wise, I think day by day, this election can't come fast enough for them because I think they're losing votes by the day. And I think they're feeling it big time. The only advantage that they have at the moment is that they lost so much in the last locals that anything looks like a win. Do you know what I mean? But I think they thought they were going to double their seats, and I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, if they come in under 20% at the first preference vote in locals and Europeans, which I think now there's a chance they might, I think it'll be a massive psychological shock to the system. But I also think the thing about Sinn Féin that's really interesting is that, you and I will always find out, and people like us will always find out, if Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are having a bad time on the doors, we'll find out. Because they'll tell you. Whereas, and this isn't just a Gript thing. It's not that I have no sources in Sinn Féin. I know a couple of people in Sinn Féin actually. But Sinn Féin don't leak. They don't leak. So you'll never read in the newspapers about a row at the Sinn Féin parliamentary party meeting ever. That has just never happened. They are a rock solid ship. So what we don't have is sort of confirmation from Sinn Féin themselves that things are bad. But everyone else who's knocking on doors, who isn't from Sinn Féin, is telling us they're getting vitriol towards Sinn Féin on the doors. And there are a lot of candidates out there, independent candidates, who tell you they're picking up votes from people who told them they were Sinn Féin voters at the last election and Sinn Féin voters up until weeks ago. So, either they're all lying to Sinn Féin, or Sinn Féin just aren't telling us the truth, or maybe everyone is deluding themselves and Sinn Féin are doing just fine. We'll find out.
But I mean, there's signs though, like Jennifer, the Inside Politics podcast, I was listening to it, Hugh Linehan, and he had Harry McGee and Cormac Quinn and Jennifer Bray on talking about the fact that they're all, doing articles where they follow different campaigns, whatever. And Jennifer Bray, I believe, was talking about how she's been canvassing with Sinn Féin, and she said it's not great, and that they're a bit kind of wounded by it. My words, not hers. But Um, that you can't, like, there's no doubt about it. Look, Mary Lou's not going to admit that, but there's a huge, huge problem there. And I don't, as I said it on the podcast before, nobody hates you like someone who loved you. It's so beyond kind of a discontent that can be, won back with a couple of, tinkering around the edges on a couple of policies. It's quite deep. And there's another thing that's interesting about it that I find is, and a lot of the time, cast your mind back to a couple of years ago, and you used to be, you're much more, or were anyway, much more of a Twitter person than I. And I remember a few years ago, you couldn't say anything even remotely close to a criticism of Sinn Fein, and you would be literally piled on Twitter by people and real nasty kind of personal stuff. And that went on for a few years, and that's gone. Do you ever notice that?
Yeah, it is. It is. But do you know what? To some extent, I mean, and I'm not disputing anything you're saying, but I feel sorry for the Shinners in one respect.
Why?
It's not their bloody fault.
We're disagreeing for the second time, because I have to say they were I'm sorry to say this, because there is a couple of Sinn Féin people that I've known over the years that I rather like. But ultimately, in my political experience, and it's long, they're always the rudest, most unfriendly. I could argue with a Labour person. I'm heavily critical of quite a number of Labour people on this podcast. And then
Who are you? We never noticed.
Yeah. And then I meet them, and you can have a laugh at them and say, like, it's not personal. Do you know what I mean? I just obviously think Labour are pretty shit, but like, it's not a personal thing or whatever. Sinn Féin are the most unfriendly, most dance on the political graves of other people. At every count I've ever been with, they're the worst behaved, they're sneering, they're not nice, rude, aggressive people. So now that they're finally getting their just desserts from people who they whipped up into a frenzy against Fianna Fáil in 2011, against Labour after that, I'm sorry, but karma comes back, and I have absolutely zero sympathy for them. They deserve every bit of it.
Well, while you've been going on your righteous rant, there's been a listener somewhere listening to this who's getting more and more and more annoyed with me because I said I felt sorry for Sinn Féin. So let me explain why. Because it's not their fault. It is the fault of the very people who are angry about them now. If you are somebody who's really pissed off at Sinn Féin because Sinn Féin didn't represent you on immigration, or Sinn Féin didn't represent you on X issue, whatever the issue may be, and you voted for them in 2019 or 2020 or whenever it was, that is your own fault. Sinn Féin didn't change. You just got deceived. Or you deceived yourself. Or you thought, oh, the Shinners are on my side, and you didn't think you'd do any research, and you didn't think you had to read their policies.
On their side, John, because the Shinners told them they were on their side, embedded in the working class communities, working for you. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and Labour, this, that, and the other, and then they couldn't even be arsed to be the opposition on a referendum that was cancelling women out of the Constitution. I don't agree with that at all. I think if you voted for Sinn Féin, and I have lots of friends who did, you voted for Sinn Féin because Sinn Féin were giving you a message that told you that they were speaking for you, and now you found out that they were lying.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, look, there's truth in what you're saying, but I also think one of the problems we have in democratic society is voter irresponsibility. This is a huge theme of mine in general.
Okay, and I mostly agree with you on that, but I don't think this is the case of that. I think Sinn Féin had, actually went out of their way to make themselves seem like the voice of the marginalised, of the unrepresented, and now they've shown their true colours. They haven't even gotten into power, and they already have alienated their base because it was all waffle.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating. We'll talk next week on the show about sort of the elections in more detail. But I definitely feel like there's still scope for a big shift in the last week. Because I think it's a funny one, because I think Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are both on course to lose seats. Fianna Fáil are particularly on course to have an awful election. But Sinn Féin are no longer on course to pick up as many as they were. So there's a big scope there for still the kind of, result that shouldn't really happen because the sort of independents are so disorganized. Present company accepted, of course, but they are.
I thought Fine Gael were going to have a few problems, particularly in Dublin, but now that Richard Bruton is topless jumping into the sea and, climbing up walls for these videos, and Maria Walsh is doing videos about her pioneering or her not drinking and her faith and all that. I think that'll be the thing what'll win it for them. You know what I mean?
I just like the slightest hint of sarcasm there.
I think
I
they're
would,
pulling themselves back from a political pasting with these videos. They're amazing.
I,
Real cool, down with the kids, hip stuff.
I was going to write about Maria Walsh's religious video during the week, and then I decided I wouldn't. Because ultimately I think a person's religious views are for themselves, and I have no evidence that she's being in any way hypocritical. But I didn't like it. I thought it was, I thought it was like, it was very cheap. Like, if your faith is so important to you, why are you only telling us now, first of all? And secondly, what does it, how does it politically influence you? Can you point to a political decision you've made in Europe that's been influenced by your faith? Or is it just like telling us that you do yoga? Because I think it's more like just telling us that you do yoga. In the hope of fooling some people who are very sincerely of their faith.
Well, that's it. It felt little bit like, somebody came into an office and said, we've done polling, and in people who identify as highly religious, you're doing really badly. So we think you should do a video of yourself sitting beside the sea talking about your faith. That'll get your numbers up in that demographic.
Yeah, I'm not in Dublin a lot as well, but I hear Regina Doherty is spending like just incredible amounts of money to try and get elected.
Incredible amounts of money, and a lot of videos of people doing silly stuff to vote for Regina. And Fine Gael vote in Dublin is, supposedly pretty strong, but I actually think that there's quite a few Fine Gael people who'll probably opt for Barry Andrews over Regina Doherty because as a campaign and as a candidate, it's not been particularly inspiring. We'll see.
Isn't it incredible? Isn't it just incredible? Before we go, I mean, I really do think this is incredible that we live in a democracy where this woman is on the ballot to represent us in Europe. And no one has asked her, not one journalist. I mean, and bear in mind, this will get clicks, it will get views. Now, Ben hasn't been able to get anywhere near her. Fine Gael are keeping her in a hermetically sealed bubble. Like, we don't get invitations to their press conferences or their press events. And probably because Ben would go along and ask her how many genders she now thinks there are. Because really, Jean Doherty,
know the answer to that, John. Well, 9 genders Doherty. I've been calling her that for 6 months, 12 months. She thinks gender.
Just Regina, if you're listening, and Ben does manage to get you in the next week, he's going to be asking you to name them. Like, I don't understand how. By the way, that video would get tens of thousands of views. I don't understand how somebody who has that kind of gaffe on their resume has skated through this election without anyone in the media mentioning it.
Because people in the media don't think it's a gaffe. A huge amount of people in the media would probably agree with that.
Well, surely some of them at least might find it a bit offensive that she left out the other 14 genders.
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, I just look. I'll say this for Regina Doherty. I've been on television shows with Regina Doherty. I was on a couple of months ago. I was with her on Virgin Media. She's a nice woman. She's a perfectly pleasant company. She's very sincere. But like, yeah, I don't see how a rational person can cast a vote for somebody who sincerely believes that there are 9 genders. That's just my personal block when it comes to that.
Let's add that to the Hall of Fame of things you would never have expected to say 9 years ago.
Well, there you go. Anyway, I'm still working through my ballot paper for how I'm going to vote in Ireland South next week. I think I've got my top 12 preferences locked down now, Sarah, but I'm still trying to decide.
One of your little quirks that I like.
I've gotten to the point now where I'm winding you up. Anyway.
I don't think you are. I can't even tell the difference because you do take it so seriously.
Yeah, we'll see. I'll let you know. I'll take a photo of my ballot paper and send it to you, but nobody else. For those of you who've been following my candidate interviews, if you've still made it this far in the podcast, this is a test for all the people who've been shouting at me all week that I have to interview Una McGurk. Una McGurk, Gript is ignoring her. Nobody's talking about her. We're really a fake media outlet because we're not interviewing Una McGurk. Can I just say, first of all, Una McGurk is not behind any of those comments. I know she's not. She's a lovely person and a decent person, and she certainly wouldn't encourage that kind of behavior. Not that there's anything wrong with it. I'm just saying it's not coming from her. But I will be talking to her over the weekend. You can expect to see that one on Monday. You can expect to hear from Michael McNamara over the weekend as well. And soon the elections will be over and I won't have to talk to any politicians again for ages, Sarah. It'll be great.
It'll be great, won't it?
It will. But until next week, when the elections are literally almost over, I think we'll leave it there. Have you any final thoughts?
No, that's it. I'm looking forward to the elections being over too, so I can crawl back into my house and forget about all of this for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. That was the week that really was. Sarah and I will see you again this time next week. Take care.